चरणारविन्दं यस्य प्रसादात् भगवत्प्रसादो यस्य प्रसादानगति वन्दे गुरु श्रीचरणारविन्दं नमो कृष्ण पृष्ठाय श्रीमती स्वामी नमस्ते सरस्वती देवी गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे विशेषशून्यवादी नमस्ते नरसिंहाय प्रह्लाद दायिने हिरण्याकशिपूर्वक्षः शिलाटङ्कनखालाय इतो नरसिंहा परतो नरसिंहा यतो यतो यामि ततो नरसिंहा बहिर्नरसिंहा हृदये नरसिंहा नरसिंहमदिं शरणं प्रपदे तव कर कमलवरे नखम् अद्भुतसिंहं दलित हिरण्यकशिपु तनुभृङ्गं केशवघृत नरहरिरूप जय जगदीश हरे जय जगदीश हरे जय जगदीश हरे। जय भक्ति विनाशक श्री नरसिंह देव भगवान की जय। भक्त श्रीमुनि प्रहलाद महाराज की जय। नमो नमः। वृंदाय तुलसी दिव्य प्रियाय केशवस्य च कृष्ण भक्ति प्रदे देवी शतवते प्रियाय केशवस्य च कृष्ण भक्ति प्रदे देवी शतवते वृंदाय तुलसी देव्ये प्रियाय केशवस्य च कृष्ण भक्ति प्रदे देवी सत्वते नमो तुलसी कृष्ण प्रेयसी राधा कृष्ण शिव प्रभु अभिलाषी पकड़ी नयने हरिबो सदा युगल रूप राशि निवेदन धरो सखीरानुगत करो सेवाय अधिकार दिए करो निज दासी दीन कृष्ण दास कोय ये नाम मोरा श्री राधा गोविंद प्रेमे सदाये न भासी नमो नमः। तुलसी कृष्ण प्रेयसी नमो नमः। यानि कानि च पापानि ब्रह्मत्यादिकानि च तानि तानि प्रणश्यन्ति प्रदक्षिणा पदे पदे। यानि कानि च पापानि ब्रह्मत्यादिकानि च तानि तानि प्रणश्यन्ति प्रदक्षिणा पदे पदे। यानि कानि च पापानि ब्रह्मत्यादिकानि च तानि तानि प्रणश्यन्ति प्रदक्षिणा पदे पदे। वृंदाय तुलसी दिव्य प्रियाय केशवस्य च कृष्ण भक्ति प्रदे देवी सत्यवतये नमो नमः। वृंदाय तुलसी दिव्य प्रियाय केशवस्य च कृष्ण भक्ति प्रदे देवी सत्यवतये नमो नमः। वृंदाय तुलसी दिव्य प्रियाय केशवस्य च कृष्ण भक्ति प्रदे देवी सत्यवतये नमो नमः। कॉपी भी लेके आना है। आज कुछ है क्या?
आज श्रीमद् रामानुजाचार्य
रामानुजाचार्य का है। आज रामानुजाचार्य का है। एक बड़ा किताब है
इसमें
अलग मिल गया
कुछ प्रकाश
करो कोई तो
Sri Ramanuja Acharya appeared in 1017 AD near Madras, South India, in a family of Vedic scholars. Sri Vaishnav says he was an incarnation of Lakshmana. The word Ramanuja means a follower of Rama. He received this name because Lakshmana always follows and serves his brother Lord Ramachandra. A boy of amazing wit, Ramanuja quickly learned Sanskrit logic and the Vedas. He took Diksha and married at age 16. Ramanuja studied with the Mayavadi guru Yadava Prakash to master Mayavadi philosophy and defeat it. When the brilliant Ramanuja kept refuting his Mayavadi arguments, Yadava Prakasha tried to murder him. Unsuccessful, Yadava Prakasha expelled Ramanuja from the ashram. Before leaving, Ramanuja completely defeated his guru's theory of oneness and no distinctions. Ramanuja explained while a certain unity can be seen in the interrelatedness of all things, still everything within the universe has its own distinct realities. Pearls strung on a thread share unity. Collectively, they form an organic whole, a necklace. Still, each individual pearl has its own unique qualities. While spirit, matter, and God may be seen as one organic whole, each has its unique qualities. Therefore, Shankara's principle of absolute oneness can't stand. Rather, the principle of unity characterized by different quality must be accepted. Sometimes later, Yadava Prakash meet Kuresh, Ramanuja's student, with a photographic memory. Quoting Shrutis, the best of Vedic proofs, Kuresh convinced him that Brahman had transcendental form. and qualities coming from the ultimate reality, the supreme absolute truth known as Lord Narayana. Ramanuja initiated anyone, regardless of caste, using the Panch Samskara purification method. He turned Shudras into Brahmans. He established that the position of a Vaishnav surpasses all social limitations and considerations. Identifying himself as a servant, Ramanuja taught the worship of the Vaishnavas. Several times, envious Brahmins tried to poison Ramanuja. To teach detachment to one disciple, Ramanuja staged the following demonstration. He told the disciple to create confusion among the sannyasi by switching their clothes at the bathing ghat. When the sannyasi, who were big scholars and renunciates, started wearing each other clothes, a big argument began. The disciple could plainly see that the renunciates were attached to some cloth. Then Ramanuja sent the disciple to the home of his Grasta disciple, Dhanurdasha. Ramanuja engaged Dhanurdasa in the temple to ensure he wouldn't be home. Following Ramanuja's order, the disciple began stealing jewelry from Dhanurdasa's chaste wife, who was sleeping. After the disciple took the ornament from one side of her body, she suddenly turned over. The startled disciple fell through the window, but he waited outside to witness the reaction of Dhanurdasa. Upon returning home, Dhanurdasa talked with his wife. I am worried that the temple needs money, said his wife. What make you think that? Asked Dhanurdasa. Because while I slept, one of the temple devotee came through the window and began stealing the jewelry from my body. To go that far, I think those poor saints must desperately need money. What did you do while he was stealing your jewelry? I turned over, but he fled through the window. Why did you do that? Said Dhanurdasa. I didn't mean to scare him. I only turned over so that he could take the jewelry from the other side of my body as well. Dhanurdasa rebuked his wife. If you were not so affected by false ego, you would have given him all your jewels. Now what shall we do? We have failed miserably. His wife lamented. You are right. It is only my pride that kept me from surrendering everything. How will we ever make any advancement? Watching all this, Ramanuja's disciple was astonished at the humility and surrender of these Grastas devotees. Ramanuja explained the meaning of these two events. The sannyasis cloth and wife's jewel. The sannyasi were so attracted to some ragged bits of cloth that they fought over it. But the grastas were detached even from costly jewels if they were needed for the Lord's service. Ramanujacharya founded Sri Sampradaya, one of the four major Vaishnav Sampradayas, Brahma, Sri, Kumaras, Rudras. This Sampradaya propounds the Vedanta philosophy of Vishishtvaitvad, qualified monism. Gaudiya and Sri Vaishnav share many teachings and practice. The Gaudiyas took Ramanuja's explanation of God and the Jiva verbatim. The principle of God is like a blazing fire, while the living soul or the Jiva is like a spark, a small part of God. Both accept three classes of Jiva: eternally liberated, forever bound, freed by devotion and sadhana. Ramanuja taught serving God in Vaikuntha with awe and reverence in Dasya Rasa, mood of master and servant. Gaudiya Vaishnav teach confidential service in Madhurya Rasa to Radha Madhav within the groves of Vrindavana. Ramanujacharya wrote many famous commentaries on the Upanishad, Puranas, Bhagavad Gita, Sri Bhashya. His commentary on Vedanta present a formidable challenge to Shankaracharya's impersonal commentary. To this day, Sri Vaishnav disciple succession from Ramanuja continue to uphold the tradition of deities worship and philosophy systemized by the founder. His samadhi is in Sri Rangam.
हो गया ठीक है, वो पढ़ेंगे प्रभु जी इधर।
Yes, Gubash.
It's a
Introduction. Ramanuja's philosophy of Vishishta Advaitvad. Ramanuja is well known as the great philosopher and Acharya of Sri Vaishnava Sampradaya. However, it should not be misunderstood that he was the founder of the Sri Vaishnavas. Originally started by Lakshmi Devi herself, the Sri Sampradaya contained many exalted devotees prior to Ramanuja's appearance, to whom he admits his depth in his writings. In their expressions of devotion to the Supreme Lord, all South Indian devotees were influenced by the 9 Alvas, who lived several hundred years before the birth of Ramanuja. Despite some minor philosophical differences, it is plain that the themes of devotion and surrender to God, which are essential to Ramanuja's teachings, are based to a large extent on the writings of the Alvas. In terms of philosophy also, Ramanuja was undoubtedly influenced by the teachings of previous Vaishnava Acharyas, most notably Yamunacharya and Bodhayan, the commentator on the Vedanta Sutras. In many ways, the major achievement of Ramanuja as an Acharya was to establish a solid philosophical basis for the devotional sentiments that had been expressed in hymns of the Alvas. In order to do this, it was first essential that he refute the impersonalist teachings of Shankaracharya's Advaitavad, and large section of his philosophical writings are dedicated to this task. To combat the teachings of the non-devotional monists, Ramanuja attacked them on their own ground, rarely expressing devotional sentiment, and for the most part citing the Upanishads and Vedanta Sutras as scriptural evidence rather than the overly Vaishnava Shastras. It is for this reason that Ramanuja, unlike Madhva, does not use the Srimad Bhagavatam to support his teachings. The main philosophical work of Ramanujacharya are his commentary on Vedanta Sutras, Sri Bhashya, the Vedanta Samagraha, the Vedanta Sar, and his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. 300 years before Ramanujacharya, Shankaracharya had attempted to establish his doctrine of absolute oneness, a concept bearing many similarities to the Buddhist except Brahman, which is formless, changeless, eternal, and devoid of all attributes. Therefore, the variety that we perceive in this world is simply an illusion and does not in reality have any existence. Because the living being is covered by ignorance, avidya or maya, he perceives variety and changes. But when enlightened by pure knowledge, he will realize that everything is in fact Brahman and that his previous perceptions were simply illusion. Obviously, in such a philosophy, devotion is also ultimately meaningless because the distinction between the God and his devotee is also illusory. In his commentary on Vedanta Sutra, Ramanujacharya strongly attacks Shankaracharya's ideas. He states that the concept of Brahman as being indeterminate, without qualities or changes, is meaningless. It's time is 6:29. It's 6:29. 300 years before Ramanujacharya, Shankaracharya had attempted to establish his doctrine of absolute oneness, a concept bearing many similarities to the Buddhist philosophy. According to Shankaracharya, nothing exists anywhere except Brahman, which is formless, changeless, eternal, and devoid of all attributes. Therefore, the variety that we perceive in this world is simply an illusion and does not in any reality have any existence. Because the living being is covered by ignorance, avidya or maya, he perceives variety and changes. But when enlightened by pure knowledge, he will realize that everything is in fact Brahman and that his previous perceptions were simply illusion. Obviously, in such a philosophy, devotion is also ultimately meaningless because the distinction between God and his devotee is also illusory. In his commentary on Vedanta Sutra, Ramanujacharya strongly attacks Shankaracharya's ideas. He states that the concept of Brahman as being indeterminate, without qualities or changes, is meaningless. Any reality that cannot be perceived, known, thought of, or even spoken about is simply fiction. The cosmic manifestation with all of its varieties may be temporary, but that does not mean it is unreal. Illusion is to perceive something as different from its real nature and not, as Shankaracharya states, to perceive something that does not in fact exist. When one mistakes when one mistakes a shell for silver, both the silver and the shell are real, but the illusion is mistaking one thing for the other. Therefore, the universe is real, but the illusion is to accept it as all in all and not consider the underlying basis of existence, which is God. In commenting on the second aphorism of the Vedanta Sutra, Jalmadi Asya Yataha, Ramanujacharya establishes that all manifestations from Supreme Reality must also be real. The Sutra states that Brahman is that from which everything else has come into being, because it does not state that Brahman is that from which the illusion of manifestation arises. It must be accepted that the manifestations are not illusory. The philosophy of Ramanujacharya presented as a logical alternative to that of Shankaracharya is called Vishishta Advaitavad or qualified oneness. It is accepted that there is an underlying unity to all existence, but this oneness of Brahman is qualified by variety. Three categories are recognized, which are distinct from one another, but together comprise a unity. These are Chit, the individual living beings, Achit, inert matter, and Ishvara, the controller, the God. Chit and Achit are seen as the body of God and thus are dependent upon Him, just as the body is dependent on the soul and cannot exist without it. This idea of matter and living being comprising the body of God is essential for understanding the relationship between them. There is unity between the body and soul, yet a real distinction is recognized. Transformation takes place within the world, and this cannot be dismissed as illusion. Shankaracharya tried to establish that nothing exists except for the one undifferentiated changeless Brahman. Transformation is real, but it pertains only to the Chit and Achit. Ishvara remains eternally changeless, just as transformation affects the body, although the soul is unaffected. So the universe and the living beings, the body of God, are subject to various transformations. He remains eternally changeless. The distinction between three categories are real. But because the Chit and Achit are dependent on Ishvara, they cannot be looked upon as being separate from Him. The living beings are inseparable from Brahman, though they are substantiative realities, and thus qualify Brahman as the body qualifies the soul. This is the meaning of Vishishta Advaitavad or qualified oneness. Chapter 2, Ramanujacharya's student life. One of the Yamunacharya's chief sannyasi disciples was Sri Shailyapurna. He had two sisters, the elder named Kantimati and the younger named Diptimati. Kantimati was married to a very pious Brahmana known as Asuri Keshwacharya. Because of his expertise in the performance of all 5 kinds of fire sacrifices, he was also known as Sarvakrutu. Years passed by and the couple lived happily in village of Bhutapuri. But because they still had no children, Keshwacharya became disturbed at heart. He decided to perform a fire sacrifice to please the Lord and thus beg him for the gift of a son. For this purpose, he journeyed with his wife to the temple of Shri Parthasarthi on the shores of the ocean in what is now the city of Madras. There they performed. Yes, Gurmaj. Years passed by and the couple lived happily in the village of Bhutapuri. But because they still had no children, Keshwacharya became disturbed at heart. He decided to perform a fire sacrifice to please the Lord and thus beg him for the gift of a son. For this purpose, he journeyed with his wife to the temple of Sri Parthasarthi on the shores of the ocean in what is now the city of Madras. There they performed sacrifices together, begging the Lord to be merciful to them and grant them the benediction of a son. Certainly Lord Vishnu was pleased by their prayers for about 1 year. Later Kantimati gave birth to a baby boy who bore all auspicious marks on his body. This was in the year AD 1017. And it was this child who grew up to be renowned all over the world as Sri Ramanujacharya, the great devotee of Lord Narayan. At about the same time, Kantimati's younger sister Diptimati also gave birth to a son. On hearing the news of the birth of his two nephews, Shailyapurna, the intimate disciple of Yamunacharya, came to visit them. He was astonished to see all the auspicious marks on the body of Kantimati's son, and he gave him the name Ramanuja, a name of Lakshmana, which means the younger brother of Ram. To Diptimati's son, he gave name Govinda. Meeting with Kanchipurna. Meeting with Kanchipurna. As the Ramanuja grew, the brilliance of his intellect soon became apparent. When he began to attend school, he could easily remember anything he was taught, even after hearing it only once. All the teachers in the school loved the boy, not only because he was a brilliant scholar, but also because of his gentle and courteous nature. At that time, there was a famous devotee of the Lord named Kanchipur, who lived in the nearby city of Kanchipuram. He was a disciple of Yamunacharya, and although he was born in a Shudra family, his intense devotion to the Lord was so apparent that even strict Brahmanas would offer him all respect. Every day, he would travel from the city of Kanchi to the village of Punamalai to worship the deity there. As Bhutapuri was midway between the two places, he would daily pass by Ramanuja's house. One evening, as Ramanuja was returning home from school, he met Kanchipur face to face and was immediately attracted by the demeanor of this holy man. With great humility, Ramanuja invited Kanchipurna to come to his house for a meal. And the great devotee readily agreed, being very much attracted to this gentle Brahmana boy. After his guest had finished his meal, Ramanuja began to massage his feet. At this, Kanchipurna protested, I am nothing but a low-born Shudra, and I am thus your servant. It is not proper for a Brahmana like you to deal with me in such a way. Ramanuja replied, if my position as a Brahmana prevents me from worship of a great soul as yourself, then I consider my birth to be the most inauspicious. Is it just the wearing of a cheap thread that makes one a Brahmana? Only that a person who is fully devoted to Lord Vishnu is a real Brahmana, no one else. Kanchipurna was filled with wonder and delight to hear the boy's firm faith in devotional service. Long into the night, the two of them sat up discussing topics about the Lord and the ways of devotion. That night, Kanchipurna stayed at Ramanuja's house and proceeded on his journey the next morning. From that day forth, both of these great devotees were bound together by the love that each bore for other. Moving to Kanchipura. When Ramanuja was only 16 years old, his father, Asuri Keshwacharya, wanted to get him married. Accordingly, he selected a beautiful young girl to be his son's bride and made all the arrangements for the wedding celebration. The festivities lasted for an entire week, and all the poor people of the neighborhood were satisfied by the distribution of large amounts of prasadam. After the couple had been married for only 1 month, however, tragedy struck the family. Keshwacharya left this world. Kantimati was afflicted with terrible grief, and for Ramanuja also it was a time of great sorrow. Now that Keshwacharya had left them, Bhutapuri was no longer a happy place for the family, and they decided to move to the city of Kanchi. Ramanuja went first to construct a residence for them, and when it was completed, they all moved there at the school of Yadav Prakash. At that time, a very learned scholar was living at Kanchi. His name was Yadav Prakash, and the fame of scholarship had attracted a large group of disciples to him. Being desirous of understanding the Vedic literatures, Ramanujacharya also became his student, and his pleasant nature and quick intelligence soon endeared him to the great Pandita. However, this relationship did not last for very long, for despite his learning and knowledge of the scriptures, Yadav Prakash was a firm adherent of the Mayavad philosophy of the absolute oneness. He thought that the all-pervading Brahman was the absolute truth and that the personal God, Lord Vishnu, was illusory. Ramanujacharya was a pure devotee of the Lord, and so he was pained to hear the statements of Yadav Prakash that denied the supremacy of his beloved Lord. Out of humility and respect for his Guru, Ramanujacharya would not point out the defects in this impersonalist teachings, but the situation gradually became impossible to tolerate. The first confrontation. One day, when the other student had gone home to take lunch, Yadav Prakash asked Ramanujacharya to massage his body with oil. At that time, one of the other students returned to the school to discuss with his teacher a passage from the Chandogya Upanishad they had been studying that morning. In particular, he inquired about the word kapisam, which occurs in the first chapter, part 6, verse 7. Therein it is stated, Kapiyasam pundrikam eva makshini. Following Shankaracharya's interpretation, Yadav Prakash began to explain that Kapiyasam referred to the rear end of a monkey, and that the whole passage meant that the Supreme Lord had eyes like lotuses as red as a monkey's rear end. On hearing this horrible explanation of the appearance of his beloved Lord, Ramanujacharya, who was still massaging his Guru, was filled with such intense grief that hot tears immediately began to pour from his eyes. When Yadav Prakash felt the touch of these tears, he looked up in surprise. Seeing Ramanujacharya's distress, he asked what was causing him such a pain. To this inquiry, Ramanujacharya replied, "O Master, it causes me such suffering to hear this terrible explanation from a great soul like yourself. How sinful it is to compare the beautiful lotus eyes of the Lord to the posterior of a monkey. I never expected to hear such a thing from my teacher." Yadav Prakash was angered by this challenge from one of his students, and he replied sharply, "I also am very aggrieved. Impudent words from an inferior are never praiseworthy. If you have become so proud that you think yourself a better teacher than me, then let us hear your explanation of the passage." "By your mercy, everything is possible," Ramanujacharya replied. Yadav Prakash smiled. "Now we are going to see this boy outdo the great Shankaracharya," he said. Ramanujacharya remained peaceful, and when he spoke, it was in a very humble way. Ramanujacharya said, "Instead of understanding the posterior of a monkey from the word kapiyasam," he said, "another meaning is possible. Kapi can be taken as kama jalam pibati, that which drinks up water, or in other words, the sun. The word asama also means blossom. So, the whole word kapiyasam can be understood as that which blossoms under the sun, or in other words, the lotus flower. Thus, we can understand the mantra of the Upanishad to mean that the Lord has eyes as beautiful as the lotus flower." Yadav Prakash was very surprised to hear such a clever explanation from one of his own students, and he realized that Ramanujacharya was a staunch adherent of the devotional philosophy of dualism. The devotee understands that the perfection of life is to worship Lord Vishnu without any personal desire, and so they never aspire for oneness as Mayavadis do. This philosophy was directly opposed to the teachings of Yadav Prakash, and after this incident, his affection for Ramanujacharya began to wane. More conflicts at school. A few days later, when Yadav Prakash was instructing his students from the Taittiriya Upanishad, he made the statement that the Supreme Brahman is truth, knowledge, and infinity. On hearing this impersonal idea of God, Ramanujacharya could not content himself. He immediately objected to his teacher's explanation, saying, "No, this verse means that the Supreme possesses truth, knowledge, and infinity, but still he has his own existence beyond these attributes." Angered by this unexpected interpretation, Yadav Prakash replied, "You presumes child, if you won't accept my explanation, then why do you come here? Why not go home and start a school of your own?" When he had composed himself somewhat, he went on more quietly. "Your explanation is not in accordance with Shankaracharya or any of the previous Acharya, so kindly keep your impertinence to yourself." By nature, Ramanujacharya was humble and meek, and so he tried to avoid such confrontations with his teacher. However, he was also absolutely devoted to the knowledge of the truth. Thus, when he heard the misleading monist interpretations being put forward by Yadav Prakash, he was sometimes unable to contain himself. In the presence of the other students, Yadav Prakash used to make light of these challenges, but in his heart there began to arise a growing fear and hatred for the boy. As he grows older, he contemplated This boy will strongly establish the dualistic philosophy of devotion. This must not be allowed to happen. I will do whatever is necessary to protect the doctrine of monism, even if it means that I have to kill him. Yadav Prakash, Lord. Actually, Yadav Prakash was very envious of Ramanujacharya, seeing in him both a purer heart and a great intellect than his own. One day, therefore, he called all his other students to a secret meeting. There he addressed them, "My dear children, none of you has ever found fault with my teaching. But this impudent Ramanujacharya has repeatedly challenged my explanations. He may be an intellect boy, but all his ideas are based on the false doctrine of dualism, seeing a difference between the self and God. He is a complete heretic. He is complete heretic who will cause havoc in society through his teachings. We must find some way to be rid of him." "Sir, surely you could just forbid him from coming to school," suggested one student. "But then our master's worst fear would be realized," responded another. "For he would open his own school and go on propagating his falsehoods all the more. Already he has written a commentary on the mantra Satyam Jalma Anantam Brahma, Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma, which contradicts everything we have learned from our teacher." This was true, for Ramanuja had effectively refuted Shankara's explanation, and his writing had been widely read and appreciated by Vaishnavas in South India, including Yamunacharya at Rangakshetra. After discussing the matter for some time, they all agreed the only way to stop Ramanuja was to kill him. They began to consider how this would be done secretly, without anyone discovering their crime. Eventually, Yadav Prakash made a proposal. "Let us all go on pilgrimage to bathe in the Ganges. On the way, there are many remote areas where we can put an end to this heretic without anyone knowing anything about it. By bathing in the sacred Ganges, we will free ourselves from the scene of killing a Brahmana, and when we return, we will simply say he fell sick and died on the journey." All the disciples readily accepted their teacher's suggestion and set out to induce Ramanuja to accompany them on their journey. Ramanujacharya was delighted at the idea of bathing in the Ganges and happily accepted their invitation. Govinda, Ramanuja's cousin, was living with his aunt in Kanchipuram at this time, and he also studied at the school of Yadav Prakash. When Ramanuja announced that he was going on pilgrimage to North India, Govind immediately decided to go with his beloved friend and relative. Danger in the forest. Kantimati was unhappy at the prospect of being separated from her son for so many months. But understanding the meritorious nature of such a venture, she gave him her permission to go. So it was that, at an auspicious moment, the band of disciples, headed by Yadav Prakash, started out on the pilgrimage. After a few days traveling, they came to a desolate region near the Vindhya hills. Yadav Prakash considered that this would be a suitable place to put his evil plan into operation, and he told his disciples to prepare themselves. However, while they were discussing the final preparation, Govind was in the forest nearby. He heard everything they said. As soon as he had the opportunity, he informed Ramanuja of the great danger he was in. When he understood the wicked intentions of his teacher and fellow students, Ramanuja left the party and fled into the forest. When his absence was noticed, Yadav Prakash sent some of the boys into the forest to search for him. But when no one replied to their calls, they concluded that Ramanuja must have been killed by some wild beast. Although secretly very pleased by this apparent turn of events, because of Govind's presence, they all pretended to be very much aggrieved. Yadav Prakash spoke to Govinda, instructing him about the temporary nature of the body and body relationships, thus revealing his cunning and treacherous nature. Meeting with the hunter. When Ramanuja heard from Govinda of the plot that was threatening his life, he was at first stunned and completely bewildered. It was just half an hour before nightfall. He was a young man of only 18 years, alone and friendless in a land far from his home. Then suddenly he felt great strength and courage enter his body. Why should I be afraid? He considered. Is Lord Narayan not the protector of his devotees? Therefore, what have I to fear from the darkness of the forest? Thinking like this, he turned his face resolutely toward the south and began walking quickly through the forest. Sometimes he thought he could hear faint voices calling him in the distance, but he never hesitated and continued on his course. He traveled for most of the night until eventually exhausted by hunger and fatigue, he rested beneath a large tree. He awoke the following day, refreshed and vigorous once more. Already it was afternoon, and so he prepared to continue on his journey. 6:55. He traveled for most of the night until eventually exhausted by hunger and fatigue. He rested beneath a large tree. He awoke the following day, refreshed and vigorous once more. Already it was afternoon, and so he prepared to continue on his journey. While he was considering which direction he should take, he saw a fuller couple approaching him. The hunter's wife said to him, "Is it because you have lost your way that you are sitting here alone in the forest? You look like the son of a Brahmana. Where is your home?" "My home is far from here," replied Ramanuja. "Way to the south. Have you heard a place called Kanchipuram?" "How is it that you are so bold as to journey alone through the dense forest, which is infested with robbers and wild animals?" asked the hunter. "I know Kanchipuram very well, and as it happens, we are also going in that direction." Ramanuja was very surprised to hear this, and so he asked, "Where are you from, and for what reason are you going to Kanchi?" "We are the forest dwellers, came the reply, "and live in a small village near the Vindhya mountains. Because we have made our livelihood by catching birds, we are now going on pilgrimage to Rameshwaram and Kanchipuram to free ourselves. To free ourselves from the reactions to so many sinful activities. It seems that the Supreme Lord who gives shelter to everyone has brought you to us for protection." At first, Ramanuja was a little afraid of the tall, dark-skinned stranger. But there was something about the affection in his face and the sweetness of his words that quickly dispelled all the misgivings from the young Brahmana's mind. As it was by now almost evening time, the follower said, "Let us go quickly through this forest region, and then we can camp for the night near an underground river that is not too far from here." They set off at once, and about an hour later came to the banks of the river. The follower collected some pieces of wood and lit a fire. Then he prepared a campsite so that they could spend the night. Just before he fell asleep, Ramanuja heard the follower's wife say to her husband, "My dear, I am feeling very thirsty. Can you look for some water for me?" "Now the night has come," said the follower, "and it would be foolish to leave the shelter of the firelight. Tomorrow you will be able to quench your thirst with the cool waters of a well, and that is just near here. The Lord protect his devotee." Early the next morning they rose and continued on their journey. Soon they came to the well the fowler had spoken of, and Ramanuja went down the steps to collect water for the wife of the fowler. 3 times he brought water to her, but still her thirst was not satisfied. When he came back for the 4th time, there was no trace of the couple to be seen. They had completely disappeared. It was only then he realized they were in fact Lakshmi Narayan, who had taken the form of a fowler and his wife just to protect their devotee and guide him through the danger forest. Seeing the towers of temples and a cluster of houses nearby, Ramanuja asked a passerby, "Sir, what is the name of this town?" The man looked at him in amazement. "Can't you recognize the reputed city of Kanchipuram?" He replied. Why are you speaking? Why are you speaking like a stranger? I know that you are one of the Yadav Prakash students, and I have seen you many times in the city. Saying this, the man continued on his way without waiting for a reply. At first, Ramanuja was taken completely by surprise at this unbelievable news, but gradually he began to realize how Lakshmi Devi and Lord Narayan had bestowed their mercy upon him. Then his heart became filled with the ecstasy of divine love, and with tears rolling down his cheeks, he began to offer prayers. Namo Brahmane Devaya Go Brahman Hitaya Cha Jagat Krishnaya Govindaya Namo. Ramanuja's written. For over an hour, Ramanuja remained at the well, wrapped in ecstasy, reciting Queen Kunti's prayers from the Srimad Bhagavatam in glorification of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Eventually, 3 women carrying water pitchers approached the well, and upon seeing them, Ramanuja controlled his emotions and proceeded on towards Kanchipuram. Ever since her son had set off on the pilgrimage to northern India, Ramanuja's mother, Kantimati, had been in a state of constant lamentation, shedding tears of separation. Thus, when he suddenly appeared at the doorway of the house, she could not at first believe it was actually him. Only when he paid obeisances and spoke to her was she fully convinced. Then she was filled with happiness and began to inquire from him, "My dear child, how is it that you have returned so soon? Where is Govind? I thought that it would be the least 6 months before you return from your pilgrimage to the holy Ganges." When the whole story had been related to her, Kantimati was horrified by the evil intentions of Yadav Prakash, but also delighted to hear of the great mercy of Lord had shown her son. At that moment, Ramanuja's aunt Diptimati, the mother of Govinda, came to the house along with Ramanuja's young wife. They were also overjoyed to see he had returned safely. They began to cook offerings for Lord Narayan, and just as they were serving prasadam, Kanchipur, who had heard of Ramanuja's arrival, came there. The two devotees warmly embraced one another, and Ramanuja invited Kanchipur to take prasadam as their honored guest. That night, the feelings of joy in that small house were practically unlimited. Studied resumed. Ramanuja continued to study the scriptures at home, and he asked his mother and aunt to tell no one about Yadav Prakash treacherous dealing. Some months later, the Acharya returned to Kanchipur along with all his disciples except for Govind. When Diptimati asked Yadav Prakash about her son, he told her, ऑनलाइन क्लास है ज़्यादा जरूरत नहीं अच्छा लिफ्ट जब तक आएगा तब तक चलेगा
पाणी मिळून घ्या. One. Oh. Only Narti Hare Krishna. Hmm.